Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Disculpen los minutos de retraso, pero hay una situación acá en el periférico, entonces nuestros invitados hoy les está costando un poquito de llegar, pero agradecemos muchísimo su presencia. Hoy con la sesión de Vuelta a Marx, una lectura crítica del capitalismo contemporáneo. Y bueno, vamos a tener hoy la sesión con la ponencia de Rehabilitar a Marx, los intelectuales y la modernidad post-stalinista. Nos acompaña el doctor Giri Ruzica.
Ruzica,
bueno, lo estoy castellanizando, no sé pronunciar, pero bueno, él viene del Departamento de Estudios de Filosofía Checa Moderna de la Academia Checa de Ciencias. Es maestro en Historia por la Facultad de Artes de la Universidad Carolina de Praga, doctor en Antropología por la Facultad de Humanidades de la Universidad Carolina de Praga, y sus investigaciones se centran en el marxismo centroeuropeo del siglo XX, la historiografía marxista y la filosofía post-stalinista y el individualismo en la biopolítica neoliberal. Reflexiona sobre autores como Kors, Lukács, Badiou, Benjamin y Foucault, por mencionar algunos. Y también nos acompaña la doctora Araceli Mondragón, que ella al final de la presentación del doctor Giri va a hacer unos comentarios. Y bueno, ella es doctora en estudios latinoamericanos por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, licenciada y maestra en Ciencia Política por la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM. Ha realizado estancias de investigación en la Universidad de California en Berkeley y en la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Actualmente es profesora e investigadora de tiempo completo en la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. Sus líneas de investigación son política y utopía en la relación sociedad-estado, memoria y función utópica como claves de interpretación de los movimientos sociales, interculturalidad, etos histórico e identidades en los procesos sociales, procesos sociopolíticos en el contexto de la reestructuración global del capital. Entonces, bueno, ya sin más preámbulos, le damos la palabra al doctor Giri. Welcome to Mexico, welcome to Centro de Investigaciones y Docencia Económicas, CIDE.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the great introduction. And first, I would like to start with a thanks, especially to Araceli and to Monica that allowed me to have a speak here or a talk here about what we do in one small country in Central Europe, especially in our department in modern Czech philosophy. And my talk will be basically presentation of our book we wrote together with my colleague Jan Nervart, which is called Rehabilitate Marx, the Czechoslovak Party Intelligentsia and Post-Stalinist Modernity. And I would like to start with a few words why exactly we do what we do, and especially regarding to why we are interested in this particular history of Czechoslovak Marxism. Because when we are in the car, Araceli asked me exactly why we do what we do, why we are interested in this past history, and I was thinking about that, and about the response, and one of the ideas that came to my mind is that when we talk about Marxism today, we usually talk about Western Marxism. So we have guys like Alain Badiou, Etienne Balibar, English Marxists like Raymond Williams, and we sometimes forget that it's quite complicated. It could be quite complicated to analyze, to apply their categories to the different countries, especially in my case, to Central Eastern Europe. So What we try to do in a way is to revive, and also what is the title of our book, to rehabilitate Marxism, Marx, and to rehabilitate its critical conceptual tools and categories in order to apply it to our contemporary situations. But in order to do that, we have to first reconstruct what was Marxism in what was, maybe is, Marxism in Central and East Europe. So that's what our work is so far. And well, I will start and I will try to read it very, very slowly that everybody understands. So in my paper, I will attempt to present the basic building blocks of a book that I wrote with my colleague Jan Mervat, which will be published by University of Pittsburgh Press, hopefully next fall. I would like to focus on theoretical and methodological background that we have built upon, and also to sketch the contours of what we have called the field of thought of Czechoslovak Post-Stalinist Marxism. As far as the context of the problem under study, the political and social situation of a small country in the middle of Europe, that means Czechoslovakia in the years 1956 to 1968 is concerned, you will certainly not miss it, but I will try to incorporate it into the theoretical introduction. So the first theoretical starting point for us was the sociological theory of modernity conceived by the German sociologist Peter Wagner. I will not discuss Wagner's comprehensive conception in detail here, but I will only touch upon a few key points. So Wagner associates modernity, so we are talking about especially Western societies, with one key feature, with the discourse and processes of liberation and the establishment of autonomy. That is, the establishment of the possibility of making decisions not on the basis of authority, tradition, or custom, but only on the basis of one's own reason. However, this liberal project, original liberal project, which the bourgeoisie usurped for itself, was soon to be subjected to various restrictions. It was the bourgeoisie that realized that in order to maintain order, advantageous to itself, of course, this liberal project had to be curtailed. Hence, the restrictions that were imposed on this initially universal project. Freedoms and autonomies were soon denied to entire groups of the population on the basis of various criteria: gender, social, racial, or medical. Hence, Wagner's term restrictive modernity. However, the general wave of industrialization in the second half of the 19th century strengthened the role of these social groups and thus their claim to these freedoms. This was one of the reasons why the whole concept of restrictive modernity came to a crisis, and during the last decade made room for the emergence of so-called organized modernity, where the main structuring principle was no longer the creation of institutions on the basis of the free associations of individuals, meaning privileged individuals, but on the basis of collective principles that rely on entities such as class, nation, state, or race. These new institutions then became mass political parties, monopolies, and trade unions in the economic sphere, but if you want to broaden our scope, also research institutions in science, or various mass associations in civil society. The concrete historical expressions of these transformations then took the form of political movements and projects such as fascism as a pan-European phenomenon, National Socialism in Germany, New Deal in the USA, and also, most importantly for us, State Socialism in its Stalinist form. As is generally known, Stalinization as a form of political, social, and industrial revolution was also applied to the countries of the so-called East Bloc, including Czechoslovakia after the Second World War. It should be noted at the outset that unlike other countries with very underdeveloped industrial base, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, Stalinization, at least in the sense of building up heavy industry, was essentially an outdated project from its inception. In the Czech lands and later in Czechoslovakia, the industrialization phase was essentially completed in the interwar period. But back to Wagner's theory. The German sociologist argues that in the second half of the 1950s, and especially in the 1960s, occurred a second crisis of modernity, a crisis of its organized version or form, its institutions and projects. Large organizations were either collapsing within themselves or were now no longer able to meet the expectations of newly emerging groups of the population. But this applied not only to the West, but also to the East Bloc. Since the second half of the 1950s, but essentially since 1953, the Stalinist form of modernity was running out of steam, and consequently, the countries of the East Bloc were undergoing recurrent economic and social crises that undermined the legitimacy of the Stalinist regimes. Stalin's death, and especially the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, where Khrushchev exposes the crimes of Stalinism, became a real landmark here. But the period was not only a period of so-called thaw or loosening, but above all, a period of debates and projects on revolutionization of the existing form of state socialism. But these debates were conducted not only among politicians, sociologists, and economists, but also, and in Czechoslovakia, spread above all among philosophers. And it was in Czechoslovakia where one of the most interesting and at the same time most differentiated debates in the East Bloc were taking place with regard to the creation of categories of thought that would make it possible to think socialism in a new way. And it is these new concepts, or old ones with new content and categories, and their presuppositions that became the focus of our investigation. The second methodology, it was the first methodological starting point. Now I'm going to the second methodological starting point, which was based on a basic and very simple problem: how to grasp the multiplicity of manifestations of post-Stalinist thought without reducing this multiplicity to a single dominant current. Herein lay often the frequent lack of analysis to date. Post-Stalinist Marxism in general has often been reduced to only one of its manifestations, so-called Marxist humanism. That is why, with the help of several famous names like Gilles Deleuze, Michel Foucault, and Louis Althusser, and their analytical tools, plane of immanence, episteme, and field of problematics, we have tried to form our own concept of the field of thought, through which we wanted to preserve both the plurality and the unity of thought of the period at the same time. In short, our problem is very old and classical one, that of grasping multiplicity within unity. The term field then may be perhaps often, or is often overused, but in our case, we think it was accurate. It is neither a structure in the strong sense of the word, it is not an ordered set of elements and their relations, nor it is a system. It means a structure with inputs, outputs, regulation, and an environment. But it should be rather understood as a set of implicit presuppositions in which different kinds of thought arise and operate as modifications of this field. Or if you want to be metaphorical, it can be described as an environment or geographical setting in which only certain animals or social species can live and survive. This field then is not identifiable with any particular theory or set of concepts, as would be the case, for example, with Thomas Kuhn's paradigm. Needless to say, this field is potentially infinite in the range of its manifestations or modifications, but with one limitation. These manifestations or modifications must always preserve in some way the presuppositions of this field. They cannot abolish or go beyond it or go beyond them. In the following passage, I will try to show what all this means concretely in the context of our analysis. As I mentioned above, post-Stalinist Marxism is usually identified with one particular current of thought, Marxist humanism. It is this current that is often credited with formulating of the most fundamental critique of Stalinism and with turning Marxism's attention to the category of human creative activity, so-called praxis. However, we wanted to show in our analysis that this is a significant flattening of the whole field of thought. In addition to Marxist humanism, we identified two other currents, so-called techno-optimism and dialectical determinism. So what are their main characteristics? Our analysis was limited to, I would say in advance that our analysis was limited to party philosophers. That is only to those who had like party legitimacy and were active in official party academic or universal institutions. So our analysis didn't cover like the non-party currents, thought currents. So that's one thing we have to have in mind. There were several other like so-called modifications or modes of thought in post-Stalinist Czechoslovakia in these times. So the first current, as I was already mentioned, it is so-called Marxist humanism, with key figures like, for example, Karel Kosík, which is very well known. At least what I know in Mexico, then Robert Kalivoda, Ivan Svita, Milan Brucha, Lubomír Nový, and others. The key concept is here the creative activity in human being. That means praxis. Then the second mode of thought, so-called techno-optimism, with Radovan Richta being the main guy and main so-called leader of this group, with key concept of science as a productive, science and technology as a productive forces. And then the third current is that so-called dialectical determinism, with Josef Cibulka, Jiří Zelený, and Václav Černík being the main guys, being the main philosophers of this current of philosophy, where key concept is the so-called dialectical conception of law, or what they will later call it dialectical objective tendency. Now we see that the picture of post-Stalinist thought is much more complex than when it is seen from only one angle, that of the humanist critique of Stalinism. After all, the emphasis on science and laws, which we also encounter in Stalinism, is not abandoned in post-Stalinism thought at all, only its content is transformed in a rather fundamental way. In short, our reconstructive critique of post-Stalinist Marxism can be characterized as follows. First, Marxist humanists criticized Stalinism, or perhaps better said, Marxist orthodoxy, notion of practice as a mere epistemological criterion of the correctness of theory. This is famous Friedrich Engels' formula, proof of the pudding is in the eating. Their aim was then to free the notion of practice from this epistemological constraint and to give it a more fundamental anthropological and also ontological content. The second current, the techno-optimists, they focused their critique on the industrial nature of the productive forces in Stalinism and advocated science and technology as the new key productive forces for future socialism. The third kind, dialectical determinists, focused on Stalin's conception of law, which they considered to be non-dialectical and essentially of traditionally causal nature. Marxism-Leninism, according to them, reduced dialectics to a mere indirectionism, where one instance acts on the other and the latter acts back on the former. But determinists argue that if this is the case, then we are not dealing with one holistic simultaneous process, as the dialectics would require, but only with two temporally separated causal relations. A acts on B, and then B acts on A, which are then subsumed under a whole that is external to them. Instead, they asserted their dialectical, I'm talking about now dialectical determinists, they asserted a concept of law as an internally contradictory tendency, which, precisely because of its contradictory character, creates different possibilities of historical development and not just linear one. If we then ask what all the modes of thought or currents of thought have in common, or rather what constitutes this field of thought as unified field, then it cannot be one of the above-mentioned currents or one of the categories they promote, but a common form of so-called problematization. I'm using now Otis or some, a point from which they all more or less explicitly start. And this is the idea of mediation as a space of indeterminacy, differentiation, and decision-making. And this was also the moment that post-Stalinist Marxism reproached to Marxism-Leninism as a variant of Marxist orthodoxy. Not primarily for being dogmatic and deterministic, these represented only surface phenomena or superficial phenomena, but for never being able to properly grasp this moment of mediation. And if Marxism-Leninism really spoke about mediation, it usually reduced it in the end to the problem of transition, for example, from one historical mode of production to another, or to a reified instance of Stalinist or the party, like, for example, in politics, where all political activity of the people must be mediated by the party, or in science, where every seeking of the truth must be sanctioned by the party apparatus or Stalin himself. Conversely, the real dialectical materialism, the so-called real dialectical materialism, has to grasp and explain the possibility of emergence of something new, which finds its place precisely in the above-mentioned space of indeterminacy, differentiation, and decision-making. However, mediation as an essential moment defining the field of thought of post-Stalinist Marxism was not the only one. I mentioned at the outset that one of our main inspirations for the conception of the field of thought was Gilles Deleuze's notion of the plane of immanence. However, Deleuze defines it not only by this very moment of thought, but also by a material one. Thus, the plane of immanence has two faces: the face of thought and the faces of the so-called matter. And so it is with post-Stalinist field of thought. The material face is represented by the so-called objectifying human activity, praxis, but not in the sense of producing and building according to a given plan, as it was in Stalinism, but in the sense of experimentation and of permanent modification of being itself. Now we may see more clearly what the rehabilitation of Marx in Czechoslovakia actually consisted of. Because we didn't come up with this title, but we took it from the title of an article written by one of our main protagonists, Josafat. It may seem paradoxical or unnecessary, at least in the circumstances of the time, to call for the rehabilitation of a philosopher who is the mainstay of state ideology and philosophy. This appeal was, in fact, twofold. On the one hand, it was a rather dangerous act for the regime because it challenged its interpretation of Marx, which is, as is very well known, much more dangerous for a given political regime than if it were to rehabilitate some ideological opponent of Marx. On the other, it meant shifting the emphasis to other texts by Marx, especially the famous economic philosophical manuscripts of 1844, and then to Grundrisse manuscripts, and of course, the third volume of Capital. But it also meant distinguishing between two Marxes: Marx of the orthodox Marxist, and Marx as the heir to Hegel's dialectics. Hence, the emphasis that was placed by post-Stalinists, especially on the phenomenology of spirit among the humanists and techno-optimists, and science of logic among the determinists. But all the previous analyses bring us to another major area in which post-Stalinist thought undergoes significant transformation, that of human subjectivity. In Marxist-Leninism, subjectivity took two forms. On the one hand, human subjectivity was first and foremost an epistemological category. human being cognizes predetermined laws, whether natural or social, that have an irreversible trajectory. So-called free activity of the human being was then reduced to the possibility of accelerating or, on the contrary, slowing down a given development, but not to changing it in a radical way. Marx's famous theorem that the human being creates his own history was often quoted, but ultimately completely denied. In its practical dimension, human subjectivity was primarily understood in the sense of the shock worker or the overman who, in building socialism, surpasses all human limits and possibilities. Both aspects of subjectivity, thus conceived, came under heavy criticism in post-Stalinist thought, and it is not hard to guess why. In neither case was human subjectivity conceived as an end in itself, nor it was provided with any space for self-creation or for free choice and self-expression. Each of the post-Stalinist currents and of thought then critically focused on particular aspect of subjectivity so conceived, and on the basis of this critique, they developed its own thought. The Marxist humanists placed so-called real subjectivity into the interspace between conscious intention and the goal, whether this was in creative artistic activity or the everyday actions represented by the type of the modern anti-hero. Here, the Stalinist Sakhanovate hero became an utterly useless, if not actually even counterproductive figure. Post-Stalinist subjectivity was no longer about overcoming human limitations within the sphere of production, because workers were, or should be, now separated from it by technology or organizational mechanisms of modern society. This is another reason why, for the humanists, the main hero of the day was a rather sort of an anti-hero, an individual who doesn't adapt, but protests against the manipulative and fragmenting effects of the modern civilization. Such types were exemplified, for example, by the good soldier Švejk, a famous Czech literary figure whose character consisted rather in a certain type of non-action, or the accursed avant-garde modern creative artists. By contrast, the techno-optimists, who had started from the same situation using the same initial assumptions, arrived at nearly the exact opposite conclusion. The humanists were undoubtedly aware of the significant differences between industrial and fully automated technology, but automation didn't mean the same thing for them as it did for technomists. It means the ticket to a new epoch civilization. Techno-optimists believed that only the fully automated production process allowed for the creation of sufficient conditions, like leisure time, for the fullest self-realization of the individual human being. It can be said that ultimately both camps were aiming for the same goal, which was the most complete and comprehensive development of human abilities. While for the humanists, the projective nature of subjectivity grew out of the resistance toward the negative effects of modern civilization, techno-optimistic self-modulation or self-creation tended to accept the demands brought by modern civilization's challenges. Last but not least, dialectical determinists firmly tied the problem of subjectivity to their conception of dialectically developing objective tendencies, so-called laws. Since its movement produces, due to its internally split contradictory nature, at least two possible trajectories of the next development, subject becomes, in this situation, a subject of decision. He or she has to choose between the possibilities, both of which are equally objective. What is striking and essentially distinguishes determinists from both humanists and techno-optimists is the initial condition of subjectivity itself. For whereas the former described this condition as being active, the determinists affirm its passivity, hence also a very different relationship of the subject to itself. While for humanists and techno-optimists, this relationship was about cultivating and developing its internally active forces. For determinists, it was about overcoming its initial passivity and getting in accord with the progressive development of the objective reality. In this case, it must be admitted they weren't that much further from the Stalinist perspective or the orthodoxy Marxist. The last issue I would like to touch upon is the question of revolution and the nature of time that is contained in it. The question of revolution must be approached from two angles. The first is the usual characterization of the post-Stalinist period as one of thaw, of loosening, and of reform. While this is not entirely wrong in itself, it more or less merely reproduces the proclamations of the party leadership itself, which precisely with the help of the vocabulary of thaw and reform attempted to keep the intellectual and social ferment within manageable limits. As such, this characterization no longer captures the radicalism with which many party intellectuals acted in the name of revolutionary change. The question now is in what sense this post-Stalinist conception of revolution is to be understood. Certainly not in the sense of political revolution, since that had already taken place in Czechoslovakia in 1948, in the case of Russia or Soviet Union in Soviet Union in 1970, when the Communist Party seized power. Nor in the sense, I mean about the concept of revolution of the post-Stalinist intelligentsia, nor in the sense of social revolution, since the ownership of the means of production through nationalization had, at least on the formal level, abolished the division of society into those who owned the means of production and those who did not. At this point, the techno-optimists revealed themselves to be essentially the most Marxist of all post-Stalinist currents of thought, because the revolution, in their view, had to be performed in the very, in their words, base of civilization, more specifically in the productive process. This is precisely what no communist party, according to them, had yet to succeed in doing. Their revolutions were only concerned thus far with political and social changes, but they didn't touch the very mode of progression of modern Western civilization, that means industrial production. And more so, they even, like the Stalinist regime or the Stalinist revolutions, they even reinforced this tendency. To find a way out of it, the techno-optimists leaned on the idea of the so-called scientific technological revolution, the idea that came from English scientist John Desmond Bernal, according to which the main driver of production would no longer be human forces or machinery, but new technologies and above all, science. The full automation of production caused by overall introduction of the new technologies would then free human being from direct participation in the production and will give him free time for his own full development. Then the development of science and technology was thus seen by techno-optimists, hence their name, as absolutely crucial to the achievement of new socialist society. Quite the opposite was true about humanists. Neither science nor technology was denied the right to transform, or more precisely, engage in a certain form of active and even positive intervention in the world. For humanists, however, the result of technological activities could be nothing more than a means to an end. Its essence then can only be utilitarian function. That is, a tool that controls human individuals through the so-called, or quote-unquote, alienated forms of manipulation. They believed that science and technology fragmented individuals because they necessarily subject them to the division of labor and thus to potentially alienating effects. Only art was able to achieve the emancipatory character because, but by contrast with technology, it was able to rid itself of the attachment to external functionality that was so typical for modern society. Thus, art and also philosophy was supposed to be simultaneously autonomous and also socially engaged. It is, or rather should be, revolutionary force. Yet, despite these differences described above, it is impossible to miss the way that both of these intellectual currents still shared one and the same intellectual space, where the idea of the fully liberated human being stood at the very center. However, meanwhile, techno-optimists, and we can include here also determinists, saw the condition for this liberation outside of the human being. That means in the development of technology and science, or progressive social tendencies, to speak in dialectical determinist vocabulary. Humanists saw it within the human being itself. Post-Stalinists, however, not only shifted revolutionary activity from one social dimension to another, but also attempted to reconceptualize the nature of the very temporality within which this activity would take place. This was manifested primarily by their emphasis on the present rather than the future or the past movement of the time series. This shift in emphasis was made possible by their criticism of the existing revolutionary conceptions. Here, too, however, there are significant differences between the various thought currents, especially between the humanists and techno-optimists. What is remarkable here is that one and the same concept of the modern revolution has been accused of the complete opposite shortcomings. While the humanists criticize this conception of subordinating the present revolutionary movement to some ideal future state to be achieved, such as building of a future communist society, the techno-optimists, on the other hand, focused on the character of the historical and hence revolutionary movement of modern industrial civilization, which, in their view, was determined by the past, or in other words, by pre-existing conditions created by past accumulation of labor. History understood in this way still has the character of necessary process in which so-called free human endeavor can cross the frontier set by the mere use of chance within the necessity of historical development. In conception of this kind, creativity and the creation of something new are only exceptions and not the rule. What is here remarkable is that in typical Marxist fashion, techno-optimists were able to uncover the deterministic and linear conception of history, not as some form of false consciousness or mistaken belief in the given course of history, but as necessary conceptual expression of the real movement of the economical, or to put it in their words, civilizational base. With the transformation of this base, such concepts, and thus the defining role of the past, cease to be justified and are replaced by the present that shows the future as an unlimited and indeterminate field of possibilities, where creativity and the creation of something new becomes the rule rather than the exception. By shifting the accent from the outlying moments in the time sequence to the present, humanists from the future, technomists from the past, Post-Stalinist thinkers took a significant step to breaking up the inevitability and linearity of time. Time could no longer progress unproblematically from starting point, the past accumulated labor, or through the present into the future at the end point of the series, nor could it move from the final point in this series, the future, that means the eventual result as a complete or finished thing, or communism as the future state of society, through the present back to the past. The foundation for events lay in the here and now, in the post-Stalinist present. So before we move on to the last section of my talk, that means to the limits of post-Stalinist Marxist thought, I would like to conclude with what is more or less the explicit or ultimate goal of post-Stalinist Marxism in general. So in order to understand it fully, we need to return once again to its philosophical critique of Stalinism, or Marxism-Leninism as its intellectual expression. The core of this critique was that Stalinism not only thinks, but also acts non-dialectically. This is because it sees all the crises and negative phenomena that occur within it, not as products of its own contradictory development, but as the results of external interventions, like, for example, the results of sabotage caused by the enemies of the Soviet Union. Doesn't matter if internal or external. Which it then, so the so-called negative phenomena, Stalinism then it tries to eliminate and not dialectically overcome. This should be the task of dialectical reason. It should, first, understand negativities, crises, or seemingly irrational phenomena as a product of the internal development of the object in question. That means socialism or social societies. And second, it should propose a way to overcome them dialectically. Post-Stalinist thinkers have attempted, if not directly conceived, then at least to outline such a form of dialectical rationality in order to provide the new post-Stalinist of socialism with the categories of thought that will enable it to continuously revolutionize its own presuppositions. To some extent, it can be said that it was a utopian project, but its aim was not some future as a finished state of affairs, but continuous, or if you like, permanent revolution, where there is no place for the irrational and discontinuous leaps of Stalinism. Finally, I would like to address some, in fact, there is one, in fact, there are more of them, internal limit of post-Stalinist Marxist thought. It is very well known what happened in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. After the removal of the old leadership of the Communist Party and the rise of the reformist wing led by Alexander Dubček, and especially after the abolition of censorship and subsequent social ferment of the Prague Spring, the Warsaw Pact troops entered Czechoslovakia on 21st August and brought the whole project of socialism with the so-called human face, or so-called socialism with the human face, to an abrupt end. The fates of our three currents of thought were very diverse. Marxism humanism completely disintegrated. Its members then switched to the positions of civil and human rights criticism of the regime. Techno-optimism was co-opted by the new normalization regime, but at the same time it was deprived of its emancipatory content. And dialectical determinism survived on the margins of the academic world without any influence on political and social development. The reason for the sudden collapse of post-Stalinist thought, especially with regard to its emancipatory and revolutionary aspects, is, in our judgment, to be found in the absence of viable conceptions of politics as a struggle for power. This doesn't mean at all that these philosophers didn't participate in political process. Quite the opposite is true. Many of them were nominated to the party's central committee or as delegates for the new party congress that was planned for the autumn of 1968. For most of them, the occupation of the country was a catastrophe that they couldn't cope with, because they couldn't admit that such a thing could even happen, and that they could consequently lose their political struggle. The situation thus caught them theoretically and practically completely unprepared. I have already mentioned the result: retreat from Marxist positions, cooptation, or marginalization of each of the currents. In effect, it was very, I would say, un-Leninist approach. And I'm mentioning Lenin here primarily because many of the philosophers of the post-Stalinist, many post-Stalinist philosophers, Czechoslovak philosophers championed Lenin, called themselves Leninists, and opposed him as a historical figure to Stalin. But it is hard to imagine that Lenin, after the lost revolution in 1905, will be or can become crushed and downhearted person resigned to his fate, or as a deserter from revolutionary positions. The correct Leninist approach would have been to analyze the situation, learn from the mistakes, and then to continue the struggle. None of this occurred with the Czechoslovak Marxist intellectuals. Probably, and this will be the last quote and very telling quote of one of the main protagonists and most prominent figures in the whole of the post-Stalinist thought, Robert Modera, when he wrote in a letter to his friend and the historian Josafat in the mid-1970s. I'm quoting, "Our present period is the result of a match lost by an entire generation who had staked their lives on it. The generation raised on Stalinism failed to cross over and bring their country into non-Stalinist and post-Stalinist socialism. This goal, which was the only real objective in this country, was unclear to them. Moreover, they didn't manage to develop a strategy for Czech society's further transition. Modern Czechs have been failing in polemics since even before March 1848. And in this sense, the most recent and modern Czech thermidor is more normal than abnormal. However, nothing is fated in human history, and we suffer from being excluded only because we have allowed ourselves to be excluded, because we failed to imprint a different shape on the course of things." So now you see what Kalibor is saying here is not in any sense blaming the Warsaw troops or even the invasion, but he's blaming themselves because they didn't have any conceptual or practical tools which will enable them to make the transition of the Czech society happen. So this is I think that's very Leninist analysis. And I will stop my talk here. Thank you very much for listening.
Y bueno, Araceli Mondragón va a ser como una síntesis en español para las personas que no pudieron seguir como tan de cerca la presentación del doctor Giri, y además va a ser un comentario a la ponencia. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Ruth. Gracias también a Giri y bueno, a Mónica Brenishnova, que fue el contacto para tener a Giri acá con nosotros. Bueno, me parece muy sugerente el texto que nos ha leído Giri Rushika, Rehabilitar a Marx, que como nos dijo por ahí a la mitad de su exposición, es un título que no se le ocurrió tanto a él y al colega con el que está escribiendo un libro que está por publicarse en la Universidad de Pittsburgh, sino que es el título que le dio Joseph Chibulka, uno de estos intelectuales post-stalinistas, a un artículo, ¿no?, en el que hablaba precisamente de rehabilitar a Marx en el contexto del post-stalinismo en lo que era Checoslovaquia, ¿no? Este título de rehabilitar a Marx nos habla de dos vertientes que se dan en esa época en Checoslovaquia en el contexto que va entre 1956 y 1968. Por una parte, estos intelectuales plantean la rehabilitación de Marx como un desafío a la interpretación dominante, ¿no?, digamos, de Estado que estaba impuesta y que incluso implica, ¿no?, un desafío político, y por otra parte, un rehabilitar a Marx aparte de una relectura con otro tipo de propuestas, ¿no?, sobre todo recuperando obras que no eran, por así decirlo, las obras dogmáticas que se estaban leyendo en ese momento, y que es, por ejemplo, retomar la relectura y la discusión de los manuscritos económico-filosóficos de 1844, los Grundrisse, el tercer volumen del Capital, y que también implicó para muchos pensadores marxistas en aquel momento retomar la dialéctica de Hegel, ¿no? Entonces, y a partir de eso, pues repensar y replantear todo el pensamiento de Marx. A partir de este contexto, lo que aquí se propone es una suerte de tipología o de un análisis del pensamiento post-stalinista que trata a la vez de entender las similitudes, la unidad que tiene este tipo de pensamiento, pero también su diversidad. Y para lograr hacer este análisis sin perder los elementos en común que tiene este pensamiento y al mismo tiempo establecer sus principales diferencias y ver pues como las grandes corrientes que ellos encuentran que son tres, que estas grandes corrientes que tienen de propuesta diversa, pues ellos lo que hacen es retomar el pensamiento de Peter Wagner sobre la idea de modernidad, ¿no? Y este planteamiento de modernidad parte pues de todas estas transformaciones jurídicas, políticas, sociales que plantean procesos de liberación y de autonomía, ¿no? Al individuo, y que es de alguna manera lo que promete el pensamiento liberal burgués, pero que, como este autor comenta, tiene pues un carácter restrictivo, porque en un primer momento es a ciertos grupos sociales los que tienen estas libertades, pero pues de facto hay otros grupos, pues obviamente los obreros y otras, las clases sociales subalternas, que no tienen acceso a estas libertades ni pueden asumir de manera efectiva pues todos estos derechos, ¿no? Entonces, a partir de esto, bueno, en el siglo XIX se dan pues una serie de luchas, reivindicaciones a partir de la defensa de derechos colectivos, ¿no? y de buscar un tipo de libertad o una modernidad que no sea tan restrictiva, sino que sea una modernidad más efectiva, ¿no? En este sentido, lo que sería Checoslovaquia aparece, ¿no? la estalinización como una forma de revolución política, social e industrial que también se aplicó a otros países del bloque del Este, pero que aquí toma formas muy específicas por el contexto histórico, ¿no? Nos comentan que hacia los años 50 y 60 hay una segunda crisis de modernidad que de alguna manera viene a cuestionar, a tener un posicionamiento crítico sobre esta forma estalinista de modernidad, que es la que precisamente se instaura como política en lo que era Checoslovaquia, ¿no? Empieza a haber pues ahí como una serie de crisis económicas, pero también sociales recurrentes, ¿no? Esto de alguna manera se vio reforzado tras la muerte de Stalin y el 20º Congreso del Partido Comunista de la Unión Soviética, donde Khrushchev pues, habla y denuncia sobre los crímenes del stalinismo, ¿no? Esto va a abrir en lo que es Checoslovaquia debates muy interesantes y una serie de discusiones que llevan a los intelectuales a pensar el socialismo de una nueva manera, ¿no? Entonces, empiezan a trabajar en torno a conceptos, categorías nuevas o a conceptos y categorías que ya se habían utilizado antes, digamos viejos, pero al que le empiezan a darle significaciones y que empiezan a problematizar o a actualizar de otra manera, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, en este contexto y tomando en cuenta esto que acabo de mencionar, aquí lo que nos proponen es una tipología, ¿no? que clasifique a los pensadores post-stalinistas sin perder de vista lo que los une, pero también marcando sus diferencias, ¿no? Nos mencionaba también Rushika que utilizan el término campo como un concepto que les permite que sin que sea tan rígido en ese sentido de usar estructura u otro, que tenga un significado, digamos, en ese sentido, pues como una suerte de camisa de fuerza, proponen pues a partir de estos tres grandes campos, ¿no? Una tipología de tres grandes vertientes o tres corrientes del pensamiento post-stalinista. Por una parte nos hablan del humanismo marxista, donde ubicamos a Karel Kosik, Robert Kalibova, Iván Svitak, perdón, estoy también castellanizando, Milan Pruska, Lubomir Novi y otros. En esta línea del humanismo marxista, el concepto clave es la actividad creativa del ser humano y digamos que su concepto clave más importante es la idea de praxis, ¿no? Que después nos explicó con mayor amplitud, pero praxis sin separar de manera mecanicista la teoría y la práctica, sino praxis como un despliegue de la subjetividad y de la libertad humana, ¿no? Y eso es lo que va a caracterizar a ese humanismo marxista. Después, como segunda corriente, nos hablan del tecno-optimismo, donde ubican a Radovan Rikta, Jan Auerhahn, Radoslav Seluki y otros. El concepto clave de los tecno-optimistas es la ciencia como fuerza productiva, ¿no? Como esta posibilidad de desarrollar la ciencia, la tecnología, llegar incluso a cierta idea de automatización que permita el tiempo libre y el disfrute, y en este sentido como cierta promesa de liberación a partir de la tecnociencia. La tercera corriente de la que nos hablan es el determinismo dialéctico, de los que son el representante Joseph Chibulka, que es de quien viene el título de la ponencia, Yidrish Sheleni y Václav Chernik. El concepto clave del determinismo dialéctico es la condición dialéctica de la ley o del derecho, ¿no? Que tienen y que es también una herencia cercana al estalinismo, según lo que nos exponían. Lo que tienen en común estas tres corrientes es la crítica del estalinismo y esa noción marxista ortodoxa, ¿no? de la práctica y de esta idea, ¿no? Más mecanicista del pensamiento. Lo que tienen en común también es que estas corrientes post-stalinistas se vuelcan sobre todo sobre un contenido más antropológico. Y bueno, de alguna manera, pues como ya había comentado, que ellos inician un debate teórico y la relectura de las obras de Marx justamente a la luz de este nuevo contexto crítico y de esta ruptura que se da con el pensamiento ortodoxo estalinista, ¿no? Algo que también se encuentra presente es las implicaciones en la subjetividad. Es uno de los puntos que ellos utilizan para poder caracterizar y analizar este pensamiento y estas tres corrientes dentro de este pensamiento post-stalinista, es ver las implicaciones que hay en la subjetividad, ¿no? En una subjetividad que de alguna manera se orienta más a la libre actividad, ¿no? Con todo y que también entre las tres corrientes hay diferencias, ¿no? En esta forma en la que caracterizan la subjetividad, ¿no? El humanismo marxista, por ejemplo, tiene, podríamos decir, una especie de giro subjetivo en el que esta libre actividad tiene que ver, ¿no? con la praxis misma de los seres humanos y que de alguna manera ve a los sujetos, ¿no? Como sujetos de acción. Los tecno-optimistas le apuestan más a esta producción automatizada, a esta idea de que la ciencia y la técnica eventualmente pueden tener cierta dinámica en la que se va a lograr concretar, ¿no? Un mayor tiempo libre, cierta libertad de los seres humanos. Por otra parte, el determinismo histórico va a plantear una subjetividad mucho más pasiva que las otras dos corrientes. El sujeto, incluso en su decisión, está muy condicionado por todas las condiciones objetivas dadas y de alguna manera es una subjetividad, por así decirlo, sujetada o más atada, pasiva, ¿no? Algo en lo que también va a haber una diferencia entre estas tres corrientes es pues la idea de la revolución, ¿no? Que en este momento se está pensando como una revolución política y en la que, pues, por ejemplo, los tecno-optimistas le apuestan igualmente, ¿no? A esta idea de que las fuerzas productivas de alguna manera pues van a llevar, ¿no? a esta revolución, ¿no? A partir de la automatización. A diferencia, y en esto tienen una postura, digamos, contradictoria con el humanismo marxista, porque acá más bien la ciencia y la técnica se ven como mecanismos o como herramientas que muy continuamente son utilizadas para dominar y para alienar, ¿no? El humanismo marxista le apuesta mucho más a la dimensión estética, al arte como una fuerza y como una práctica revolucionaria. Entonces, esta es la diferencia que hay, ¿no? Entre estas dos posturas. También analizan cómo se está planteando la cuestión del tiempo, la temporalidad, y encuentran que, por ejemplo, es interesante cómo el humanismo marxista y los tecno-optimistas privilegian el presente, aunque de maneras pues, radicalmente distintas. Para el humanismo marxista, la praxis humana y el actuar de los seres humanos en el mundo es lo que los sitúa en el aquí y el ahora, ¿no? En cambio, pues a los tecno-optimistas es la idea de un proceso histórico que sitúa en el presente, pero que no le da tanta fuerza, ¿no? A los sujetos como sujetos de acción, ¿no? Es como una idea cierta idea de la historia y del tiempo que es distinto. Lo interesante es que aunque tengan estas posturas, digamos, hasta contrarias, a final de cuentas son propuestas que rompen la linealidad del tiempo, que de alguna manera era como que la forma en la que se construía esta temporalidad del pensamiento stalinista, ¿no? Y que de alguna manera llevan a una crítica de lo que, de la idea, ¿no? De la racionalidad dialéctica, y que llevan a una crítica, por ejemplo, que de un pensamiento ortodoxo que estaba muy generalizado, en el que, pues, como que todos los problemas y las contradicciones en las sociedades no eran internos, sino que venían de fuera, ¿no? De un sabotaje a la Unión Soviética, de problemas externos, pero no de las contradicciones internas, perdón. Entonces, algo de lo que van a hacer estos pensadores dentro de esta crítica y con todo y que a veces tienen propuestas diametralmente opuestas, es quebrar esa idea y volver efectivamente sobre un planteamiento dialéctico que incluye la crítica de las contradicciones internas. Y esto va obviamente a tener un impacto muy fuerte dentro del pensamiento checoslovaco en esa época, y obviamente pues también en mucho pues de las relaciones políticas y de todo lo que se estaba manejando en ese momento. Al final, bueno, nos comentan que estas tres corrientes de alguna manera o se disolvieron o se perdieron, o se quedaron circunscritas al mundo académico únicamente porque hubo una ausencia, digamos, de una lucha política por el poder, no de una lucha política en el sentido de una visión crítica o que no hayan participado todos estos intelectuales de manera activa en la política, pero no se plantearon esa lucha efectiva por el poder, y eso hizo pues que quedaran de alguna manera en ciertos sectores que fueron marginados o que de alguna manera se perdieran, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, pues eso es lo que podría comentar como a grandes rasgos, haciendo como una mirada muy sintética de lo que nos dijo el Ruth.
Muchas gracias, Araceli.
Gracias.
Síntesis, una compilación muy sucinta, muy sintetizada, muy exacta de lo que presentó el doctor Giri. Y bueno, agradecemos sobre todo para las personas que nos siguen en las redes sociales o en este momento en vivo o más adelante, pues podrán también escuchar esta traducción, digamos, esta síntesis en español. Quizá les va a ser más fácil seguirla, donde pues nos habla como estas tres corrientes, ¿no? Que siguieron como a esta vertiente post-stalinista. Entonces, bueno, no sé, acá también ya nos acompaña el compañero Oscar Rojas y otro colega, bienvenido, gracias por acompañarnos. Y bueno, no sé si hay algún comentario o pregunta por parte de Josafat, de Oscar o del compañero.
Well, I would like to say thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I learned quite a lot of the history of the Marxian tendencies in Czech Republic. For me, it was very, very interesting to see this map you presented. And I have some questions that has to do with some of the topics you mentioned, but I would like to know more about that, because you mentioned a topic related with mediation and the role of a party in a totalitarian regime, where the totalitarian regime has a party that is presented in the whole society. And then the mediation of society and the government is by the party. So I wonder whether these new approaches of post-Stalinist Marxism has a new characterization of the role of the party in the social processes, in order to avoid that the party becomes a kind of terminal, because you also use the notion of terminal. And for me, it's a key topic in order to see how we could avoid that in Latin America. The role of the political parties are very important in this region because we are situated in a class struggle, and we think that the political parties are very useful in order to change the world. So how to avoid that? How to avoid that the party become in this monster? So this is one topic. Another topic that I would like to know more about your view has to do with a topic that you mentioned about the industrial civilization. And I'm wondering whether another civilization could has another kind of material grounding that are not based on industrial processes. So, for example, the theories of the growth has to do with these processes of production more ecologically sustainable. So I'm wondering whether these approaches has a different notion of production, and in that sense, do they have a post-industrial, not post in the sense of the actual economy, but in another sense of post-industrial civilization, something like that? And thank you so much for your presentation.
En español ahora, para las personas que están siguiendo la transmisión.
Sí, muy rápidamente, bueno, lo que comentaba compañero doctor filósofo Giri es acerca de el papel que han tenido los partidos políticos en diferentes partes del mundo y cómo la noción de mediación, porque él habló de una mediación entre la clase trabajadora, el pueblo, el gobierno, y el partido siendo la mediación entre el pueblo, y cómo en República Checa se generó esta situación donde el partido creció, se volvió un partido totalitario y al ser un partido de ese tipo se convirtió en un ternidor de los procesos revolucionarios. Entonces, ahí me gustaría conocer más sus opiniones acerca de esta situación, de cómo evitar que los partidos políticos de izquierda, sobre todo, se conviertan en ese ternidor. La otra pregunta tenía que ver con las bases industriales de la civilización y si en estas perspectivas post-stalinistas había una perspectiva, digamos, postindustrial acerca de los procesos de producción que fueran más ecológicamente sustentables y que, bueno, se considerara temas como la teoría del decrecimiento económico.
Gracias. Podemos dar paso a que el doctor responda.
Okay, well, definitely. Thank you much for this. Those are really big questions.
Yes.
And I can start from the perspective view of the post-Stalinists themselves, how they see this problem. The one thing which is very curious and very weird is that on one hand, those party politicians, they were kind of critical to the role of the party in science, but also in politics. But most of them, at least up to the 1960s, turn of the 1967, 68, they couldn't have imagined any kind of politics without the communists, not without parties, without the communist party. Most of them were like very tied to the communist party, even subjective. But what they want to promote is like what we can say is pluralization voices within the party. So that means like in the Stalinism, it was in that way that. There was definitely discussions in Stalinist political party, but the Stalinist party should act like in like social and political sphere as a unity. Mm-hmm. What they want to challenge is exactly that like I am not tied to the party in the sense that I have to have that the party first has to give me like free room just to say something which is not within the party line. Mm-hmm. And what they claim is this free space. I, as an intellectual, can speak for myself and can say like my free opinion on this, and so be like another like like epistemological voice, which is not subsumed under the central committee or whatever, which sanctioned my free opinion or whatever. So, but even within this critique, they were not able to imagine like the transition to another socialist society, different social society, without political party. Until 1968, where like from there was like top, like down to top, like movements which try to establish the workers' councils. And this movement was very strong. And even like the famous economist Potashik, he like began as a typical like economist, intellectual, party intellectual, was promoting reforms. But in 1968, he kind of turned to this down to top like movements of workers' councils, and he saw in them like the potential to transform the rigid form of the state socialist economy. So it was like what concerns the role of parties in contemporary politics. That's complicated because we know about the law of bureaucratization and things like that. But what we need is definitely some kind of organizations. That's without debate. I don't want to promote any kind of like civic society ideology here, but the thing with the parties is that it's very different than it was in like 1960s, or at least in East Bloc countries. So the thing is that every different voice in the societies in that time has to be channeled through the party. That is not the case today within our liberal democratic societies. So I think what is crucial is to have channels or organizations that can have like real force, and in the sense that they have like conditions and means to promote their policies. So we don't have that because we know that actually the contemporary parties are tied to a lot of economical influences and things like that. So that has to change. I don't know how. So that will be, we can debate about it, I guess, more on that, but I would like to restrain myself to this very simple response. About industrial civilization, the idea within the intellectual sphere of post-Stalinist Marxists was that we have to get rid of ourselves of the industrialization as a mean or tool or sphere which organizes our social life. That was the same with humanists. That applies in the same way for humanists and technologists alike. But the difference in between them was that humanists wants to establish different sphere of like free expressions or transformations of society. So they put a lot of emphasis on art or even on philosophy. And they saw every kind of labor activity in the sense of like in the sense of type of activity which is forced upon you and which you have to do. They see it as some kind of a sphere that you have to transcend, or that the life, your real life, is beyond this. And they didn't pay much attention to the transformation of those conditions of work. Unlike with technologists, they saw the revolution of the base as some like the most crucial thing that has to be performed, but and has to be performed in the way just to overcome it and to go beyond that into some kind of post-Fordist automated production. But any kind of degrowth that they didn't have in mind. Okay. in this time. It was like out of any kind of imagination. Wow. And well, we can talk about degrowth for quite a lot of time, like, you know, but I do think I have. I think the question is too complicated. Like I myself, I would be definitely for degrowth in some kind of sense. Mm-hmm. Definitely, that would be for our contemporary situations be needed, because like they don't have any kind of. There are limits we cannot cross. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's what I like to.
Thank you so much.
Because that's too complicated.
Yes.
I have to prepare for
¿Traducimos lo que dijo?
Sí, haz una síntesis.
Muy rápidamente, porque en realidad, bueno, lo que respondió compañero, lo que yo le entendí, es que en el primer caso, el rol de los partidos políticos, pues era muy importante en la época en la cual se llevaba, digamos, las demandas de la sociedad al gobierno. El gobierno, digamos, hacía acciones para poder atender estas demandas. Posteriormente vienen diferentes temas, pero hay un quiebre en 1968, en particular ahí es donde más bien se ve la burocratización, se ve el desligue de los partidos políticos de las demandas del pueblo. Se usan los partidos políticos ya no para llevar las demandas del pueblo, sino para reprimir y controlar, y entonces en ese sentido ya dejan de tener un papel revolucionario. Entonces lo que ocurre es que la gente empieza a tener desconfianza de los partidos políticos y ya, digamos, ahí se agota. Y lo que comentaba el compañero era que de que habría que pensar en diferentes organizaciones. ¿Qué tipo de organizaciones? Pues digamos, eso es el debate, pero tiene que haber alguna organización que sirva para llevar las demandas de la población. No está pensando en civil society, en las ideologías de la sociedad, eso es, sino que más bien estaría buscando otro tipo de organizaciones, pero bueno, la respuesta queda abierta, ¿no? La otra cuestión tiene que ver con que la civilización industrial tiene que ver con un sentido de vida, con un sentido también del trabajo, donde también, digamos, los marxistas, en particular de la corriente humanista, trataban de ver más allá del trabajo, ver más allá de la alienación, ver más allá de lo que sería el estilo de vida tradicional, y más bien pensar que el sentido de vida tiene que ser distinto, pero no teorizaron tanto en cómo sería una base industrial diferente, y los tecnooptimistas sí. Y los tecnooptimistas sí que pensaban en una base diferente, sobre todo respecto a las bases de la ciencia y la tecnología, pero la parte ecológica estaba fuera del análisis, y pues en ese momento no se discutía sobre la teoría de crecimiento ecológico, y que bueno, eso es parte de una discusión que ahora se tendría que dar.
Gracias. Bueno, por acá también nos acompaña el doctor Oscar Rojas, colega de la UNAM, que también es parte pues muy importante de este seminario, ¿no? Así que él y yo ideamos esta aventura y que hasta hoy sigue, y nos da mucho gusto que hoy estés acá, Oscar. Adelante.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Muchas gracias. I will first elaborate in Spanish just to order my thoughts, and then I will transmit you the essence of my claim. Pues muchas gracias, pues también para mí es un honor estar aquí, escuchar toda esta discusión, pues me da mucho entusiasmo porque, bueno, pues ahorita como se comentaba, desde el mismo nombre aquí de este seminario, el Seminario Vuelta a Marx, pues es la esencia de recuperarlo, es la esencia de tomarse en serio, de que es una energía epistemológica necesaria para analizar la complejidad, ¿no? Particularmente cuando la complejidad se está manifestando realmente en los procesos de transformación, ¿no? Y bueno, me refiero por supuesto a todo lo que hemos vivido aquí en México también, ¿no? Esta aceleración de cambios pues nos lleva hacia esta necesidad de análisis dialéctico, ¿no? Y aquí mi pregunta, o lo que quiero poner sobre la mesa ahorita que se hablaba de los campos, el campo del determinismo dialéctico, y el asunto de que, bueno, pues viendo ahí los representantes, yo me formé leyendo a CIDE y a Seleny, ¿no? También, ¿no? O sea, y fueron ahí, la verdad es que grandes aliados, ¿no? Para comprender la complejidad del capital y comprender también la complejidad de la totalidad real, ¿no? O sea, de la totalidad orgánica, ¿no? Entonces, para mí es muy serio el asunto de la dialéctica porque es el puente entre la categoría y cómo se genera su dinámica real y efectiva, donde hay verdaderamente peligros el termidor, ¿no? Es decir, si nosotros no ubicamos esa rotación dialéctica que viene con la revolución, pues dejamos de lado que hay siempre la posibilidad, diría Walter Benjamin, el momento de peligro, ¿no? De que las cosas simplemente no funcionen y que esto se vaya hacia atrás, ¿no? Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cómo nos vamos a tomar seriamente la recuperación también, no solamente a Marx en abstracto, sino la cosmovisión lógica que desarrolla en el Capital y que es un instrumento que no es, es decir, el Capital es una primera versión o una expresión de la fuerza de la dialéctica, ¿no? Pero la dialéctica en sí nos da para abrir el panorama a otros avances teóricos, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo ponemos sobre la mesa la recuperación de Marx? A través de la recuperación de la dialéctica, no en el sentido enunciativo, sino como una práctica pedagógica revolucionaria, ¿no?
I will.
I understood something, but not everything.
Yes, if you want to do the translation.
Yo tengo otra pregunta, pero no sé si.
He assumes the Marxist epistemological as heritage, and then he is concerned about the dialectic, and the big question is how to rehabilitate Marx today about this.
No sé si puedo hacer yo de una vez también mi pregunta, es sencilla. Bueno, viendo estas como tres enfoques que se recuperaron después en el post-stalinismo, pues pensar en este humanismo marxista justo porque aquí tuvimos también a un filósofo, a Oliver Kozlarek, que justo habló de humanismo, ¿no? Incluso a él le hacían esta pregunta sobre qué opina del humanismo mexicano, porque es un planteamiento que hace el actual presidente. Entonces, por un lado, la pregunta sería si cómo se recupera o qué vigencia tienen estos planteamientos hoy día en esta idea también del título de la ponencia, en específico Rehabilitar a Marx, y en el título mismo, como decía Oscar, de todo el seminario que cobija estos planteamientos, Vuelta a Marx. Y la otra es que hoy justo en la mañana estábamos en un seminario que tenemos aquí también, un seminario interno de lectura, reflexión y análisis del Capital, y parte de la temática fue, aunque apenas vamos iniciando, ¿no?, con el primer capítulo del tomo 1, volumen 1, pero salió el tema de la tecnología. Entonces me llamó mucho la atención este enfoque del tecnooptimismo, porque incluso anoté también los autores, me gustaría revisar que dicen, si bien pues hay cosas como ahorita se mencionó que se deben reflexionar pues a la luz de lo que hoy tenemos, que es esta cuestión de la destrucción ecológica, pero ¿cómo los podemos traer hoy a la actualidad? Porque me parecen vigentes los planteamientos, ¿no? Esta idea, incluso hoy se habla, ¿no?, que con y lo mencionábamos en la mañana, con que la inteligencia artificial y la automatización, si nos va a liberar, nos va a someter más, ¿no? Nos va a liberar nos va a emancipar de la carga del trabajo. Y fue un poquito por donde fue la reflexión hoy en la mañana, y llama la atención que hoy, por la tarde, vuelve como el tema. Entonces, la pregunta en sí sería, ¿son vigentes estos planteamientos y cómo se pueden recuperar? Sobre todo, bueno, son autores que yo, más allá de Karel Kosik, no conocía, sinceramente. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos también desde acá en Latinoamérica recuperarlos? Su vigencia, su pertinencia. Gracias.
How to think, say, these fields, and about the actuality of these fields, how to think if these fields could say something to us in this time, right now.
But actually it has to do also with the discussion of artificial intelligence and how we have different technological issues we should address. So she's wondering about what techno-optimistic authors could be relevant for today.
One tougher question than the other. I would like to begin with Oscar's questions about the rehabilitation Marx today, and I will speak definitely from the perspective of post-Stalinist thought, and I hope that I will answer also the question of Ruth. And what, for example, like my favorite currents of all those post-Stalinist field of thought are the dialectical determinists, because they are the least less known. And there are like a huge amount of texts which were completely out of sight, like even for the Czech Marxists, the contemporary Czech Marxists, if there are any. And like, for example, my favorite is Josef who gave the name to our book. What he says, like in 1968, when he finished his masterpiece, Dialectics and Ontology, he said that the work on Marxist ontology is almost finished with my book. What you have to do now is to elaborate the Marxist epistemology. And what his, I would say, disciples were doing during the 1970s and 1980s, especially in Bratislava, that was the capital of Slovakia, where many things were possible during the 70s, 80s, which were not possible in Prague. So they tried to formulate, to conceptualize dialectical reason. What is dialectical reason? They produced quite a lot amount of text, and there were also a lot of conferences. What can be dialectical reason? And this project hasn't been finished at all. And this is something where we can join this effort and try to reconstruct that what Arde and I myself would like to do in the next few years. Try to reconstruct what they think about, what they think under the term of dialectical reason, and about what means dialectical epistemology, in this sense. Because Josef Cibulka, he devoted quite a lot of time to conceptualize what is the so-called dialectical objective tendency, and he used for this reason, he used the third volume of Capital, where Marx talked about the law of falling rate of profit, and that's just economical. And what is Marx doing here? He says that the law of falling rate of profit definitely applies. It exists, but it is dialectical in the sense that it produces its contradictory moments that speaks against it. So the dialectical tendency is not in some kind of it's not in any sense any type of ideal type, to speak in Barbarian terms. It's not like my ideal construction that I put against the reality, and then I see if it is correct or it is not. It is actually a real movement, which is producing its own contradictory moments, which speaks against it. And the interesting step of what Cibulka did with it, he said he extrapolated this law to the working of the objective tendency as such. He said the law of falling wave property is only, say, one materialization of the general objective, of the concept of general objective tendency, which produces then like different like possibilities of objective, of real development. So this concept of objective, contradictory or dialectical objective tendency will be one of the like very interesting tool how to conceptualize Marxist epistemology. What could mean dialectical epistemology, and oppose it to like, for example, to empiricism of Weberian neo-Kantianism. That would be like my position, but what I would like to do, I'm not. I don't want to speak for others. So that's and that would be also like the something that can be inspirations for us today, for us for Marxists. And what concerns I don't think that techno-optimists would have any ready-made answer for contemporary situations regarding the artificial intelligence and things like that. I would say they will definitely welcome it, and because the situation they encounter in the 1960s were quite the same, mutatis mutandis, of course, and the thing is that they will welcome it because it will give people more leisure time. But what we need is socialist conditions for it. Because, like, and it might be a bit of contradiction within their own philosophy. Because on one hand, they say, like, okay, the development of science and technology is like the most crucial thing. We have to develop. And on the other hand, they say the emancipatory or the new technologies, new science can have emancipatory effect only under socialist conditions, only under socialist relations. So now is what does it say? Does it say that the socialist relations they had in those times is enough? It's okay that we have like it's like finished revolution, finished structure, and then we have just to focus ourselves on technological or scientific revolution, or should we also revolutionize the social relationships? So that was kind of a dilemma we see now, but they didn't see it they didn't see it as a problem. So I would definitely think that they would welcome it, but they would welcome it only on the different social relationships. Definitely not on the capitalism. Okay. So now, what would that's like coming to my mind? Now they would propose more, I would like to say, socialist revolution in our conditions. So it would be quite the reverse of what they were saying in the 1960s.
Okay, thank you. ¿Quieres comentar algo final, Josafat?
De lo que dijo, hacemos traducción, ¿no? Sí, bueno, lo que yo entendí que respondió respecto a lo que comentaba Oscar es que el tema de la dialéctica, sobre todo el tema de la corriente que llaman dialéctica determinista, construyó nociones que requieren de discutir, de análisis, porque hubo términos que no queda muy claro exactamente qué querían decir, y sobre todo porque la herencia stalinista era una perspectiva dialéctica que no era hegeliana, ¿no? Entonces, en ese contexto hay temas que se requieren como tener muy claro qué quiere decir, por ejemplo, la razón dialéctica, ¿no? Entonces, esta recuperación que se haría de Hegel pasa por presentar una investigación sobre qué se entiende por razón dialéctica, y también pasa por explicar qué se entiende por epistemología y las consecuencias epistemológicas que tiene el pensamiento dialéctico. Entonces, puso el ejemplo de cómo en la obra de Marx no es transparente, digamos, el uso de la dialéctica en algunas partes, como por ejemplo la ley de la tendencia creciente a la tasa de ganancia. Preguntó, bueno, ¿esto es dialéctico? ¿En qué sentido sería dialéctico? ¿En qué sentido podemos hacer esa interpretación? Y bueno, eso es parte de una discusión, pero lo que sí plantea es que la respuesta que demos tendría a su vez que tener como requisito una interpretación diferente a lo que sería el empirismo, para no caer en un empirismo. Entonces, es un tema que requiere trabajo. Y respecto a Ruth, lo que comentaba era que los tecnooptimistas probablemente estarían de acuerdo con la inteligencia artificial, estarían promoviéndola, estarían a favor de ella. Él comentaba que ellos como que no tendrían mucho que decir respecto a esto en términos más críticos y que más bien se tendría que buscar otras respuestas en otras perspectivas.
Sí, aunque bueno, también ha cambiado radicalmente, ¿no? Lo que era el capitalismo de esa época a la forma capitalista que estamos viviendo. Y quizá incluso los tecnooptimistas tendrían que recapitular, ¿no? Y repensar, y quizá tendrían más claro que no habría un determinismo en el que la pura revolución científica y tecnológica iban a llevar al cambio, sino que a lo mejor hasta si vivieran en esta época, aunque es pura especulación, estarían planteando la necesidad de la revolución en las relaciones interhumanas, intersubjetivas, el cambio y la revolución en las relaciones sociales, ¿no? Como imprescindibles, porque en este contexto queda muy claro.
Claro.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, pues si ya no hay mayores comentarios, también saludamos a las personas que nos siguieron en la transmisión en YouTube. Estaba por ahí la maestra Carolina Hernández, que también es una importante colaboradora de este seminario. Y pues nada, thank you very much,
Thank you.
professor. Welcome to Mexico. Okay. Y bueno, pues nos vemos. La próxima sesión va a ser el 18 de octubre para que por favor estén pendientes de los avisos que se dan en el Twitter del Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, este centro público de investigación del Consejo Nacional de Humanidades, Ciencias y Tecnología, el CONACYT. Y pues muchas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Gracias, Ruth.
También gracias.